I think most people don't know that much about corporate governance. So either people are quite ignorant because they're executives and for them it's something above, it's the board, something distant, and they say business is doing stuff, executing projects, and so they think the board is sort of not something very important. So many people underestimate the role of the board. I think that is one, and I think this is not a Ukrainian issue. The big surprise at INSEAD has been that we have experienced people, and most people actually don't understand what boards are for and why you should have them. So I would say first, relax and let's learn, but you have to go back to principles, I think. And that's the other mistake, is that in every country, of course, governance is a legal obligation, so it's very national. But the principles are actually more similar than they're different. So a big principle is, can the CEO be the chairman of the board? And I think that's one of the big differences. I will come back to that. But then there are also habits, and the real habit is what do boards do? Do they just approve things, or do they really challenge the management? If you challenge the management, is this a bad habit where you say, in some countries, Asian countries, if you challenge too much, they say calm down, you're breaking the harmony, you're not there to challenge. So what is the habit of a board? And I think, what do people expect from a board? So some boards are rubber stamping boards, and others are really helping support value creation. So the first I would say is, most people don't really know enough. People are too biased by national legal aspects, and I think they don't spend enough time on the spirit. It gives the big advantage, it gives you confidence. If you are a shareholder, you're going to talk to the owner, but then the owner might sell. You might talk to the CEO, but the CEO might change. And so I think it's the board that gives you stability and confidence. So I think, and it's not just the board, but the board process, which is, even if you have a different board, the way this company is governed is serious, will be well done, and you can have confidence. And I think the more you have confidence, the more you will invest. Secondly, even if you're the owner, owners have great visions. They are very optimistic. They will say, my business will work. I would say they're very often not just optimists, delusional, which is, owners are very optimistic people. Otherwise, they wouldn't be owners. Why would you own an asset you didn't believe in? And it's going to work. It's going to work. But I think the problem, I have a friend who is an Everest climber, and he says, on Everest, hope is not a plan. So hoping that the business will work well is not a good plan. You need to build a plan. You need to give confidence, reality on success. And I think building a successful business is like going to Everest. I would almost argue it's easier to go to Everest than build a successful business. So you want to have a bunch of people around you. You want to have a vision, a project that can come from the owner. But then you need to have a people who actually make the project work. And I think the people who make the project work are the executives, people who believe in the project, but also the governors who give the guidance to the executives, because we are very, very biased, and the people who are the most convinced are the most biased. And I think the board probably first helps to avoid big mistakes. For example, we should get out of this country, we should get into another country, we should get into another business. Most CEOs, when they're not very good, the CEO says, well, it's not a good CEO, but could be worse. The leverage of a CEO is enormous, so I think the board will go to the owner and say, no, I think let's try for another one. Actually, because the CEO is not that good, there's no reason to not try with somebody else, because the next one, if we choose him well, will be better. So I think greater confidence to shareholders, greater confidence to employees, because owners too can be cyclical. They love the business, then they say, oh, this is not what I wanted, then they sell the business. So at least when the owner changes, the board remains the same, or the board continues. So it also gives confidence to the employees. I think it also gives confidence to the communities, which is who's responsible when there's an accident. And then finally it gives confidence to the government, because the government has somebody to, to talk with. Owners, they move from one country to the next one. You don't have. I would say the cost of capital is less for well-governed firms. So basically, it's easier to get investors. You have to pay less of a return in terms of expectations. It's increasingly agreed that well-governed is not sufficient to have a board. You need to have an effective board. But well-governed boards increase the performance and increase the sustainability. And I think well-governed companies have a better reputation. So I think these are all the reasons why you should have a board, because there is no counter evidence. The counter evidence is if you have an ineffective board, given that boards are important, it's better not to have a board. So it's not just having a board, it's having an effective board. This goes back to training, selecting the right members. Increasingly, as society takes governance more seriously, there now is a database called BoardX. If you are in BoardX, it basically lists all the directors of all the companies in the world. And I think there are increasingly dictionaries, if you wish, or directories of board members. So, because trust is so important in boards, of course, trust is generated. I come from Belgium, trust is in the village. If somebody comes from another town, another village, you're distrustful. So, of course, networks is a way to get people on boards. But increasingly, you have headhunters, you have professional search. By the way, if you have the owners, the board members, and the employees look at their networks, it's a wide network. So I would say have broad networks and choose within the network, because in the network, you have a lot of information about the people. One of the key issues that people discover is that there is a duality between shareholder supremacy, which is in the end shareholders decide everything, and most important, they appoint the board members and they remove the board members. And then the fiduciary responsibility of the board members, which is legally, the corporation is like a person. They have rights and responsibilities. They can be terminated. The corporation could be closed by the government or by the courts. And the people who are responsible for the bad doings of the corporation, corpus, like in Latin, a body, the people that are responsible are the directors, not the shareholders. So shareholders have a responsibility which amounts to the money they put in. So they can lose all their money, but that's it. And somebody in the court, when something goes bad, the people want to make who's responsible, and this is the board of directors. And so there is a duality which most people don't understand, which is that the board of directors are responsible for the organization and for all of its interactions with the surrounding, with the clients, with the shareholders, with the government, with the local communities, like Bhopal, Union Carbide. When there was a big chemical accident, or in Italy, it's actually the board of directors of Union Carbide India or Union Carbide Italy that was responsible. And very often the director said, yes, but this was decided not in the board, this was decided in corporate headquarters in the US or something like that. And the courts will say, no. You are the directors of Union Carbide India, so you are responsible. So shareholders put money in, take dividends out. Customers pay for everything, and boards are responsible. That is sort of typically the way the board is organized. And of course, the people who will supervise this are the government through the courts and also through the tax authorities, because they want the corporations to pay taxes. So when you join a board, you're actually collegially responsible, and it's team play. So it's really like soccer. Team wins, team loses. If one director is bad, if one player is bad, but the team wins, it's okay. If one director is very good, he has the right answer, but the board decides otherwise, the good player is good, but the problem is the team has lost. So I think as a board member, you are collectively responsible with your board of directors. Now, if you're by yourself, sometimes you have a one-person board, then it's easy, right? but it's also a lot of responsibility. That's why people also like to join boards with more people. For example, in the financial crisis in the US and in Europe, nobody went to jail. One of the reasons is because a board has 20 people. So then the judge says, well, I can't send 20 people to jail. This is now changing. So in the US, there have been rulings where a whole board was held accountable, of 14 persons, because they were defrauding some of the minority investors from their profits by selling some real estate very, very cheap. And the courts actually felt that the directors were liable, and they were all condemned, all 14 of them. So I think the practice is rapidly changing, and I think this is a very good thing. I think if you're in a democracy, if you are responsible, you want business to be responsible, and that responsibility is not with the shareholders, is not with the executives, it's with the board. So be very careful when you join a board, because A, you have to see who else is on the board, because I'm going to be in a team with these people. And secondly, you know, the courts will go after you, not necessarily after the shareholders. And this is in all countries like that. And legally, I don't see how it could be different. The grass looks always greener in somebody else's garden, you know. So when you are a one-tier board, you know, then some people say, oh, it would be better to have a two-tier board. Actually, mostly it's like you say. People who have a two-tier board, they look at countries like the UK where you have a one-tier board, and they think this is better. So in some countries, this is the legal aspect, you have the supervisory board, which is people who are not executives. And the board are basically people who are not executives. And one of the reasons is because if I have to judge myself, I'm either going to be too hard or too easy, typically too easy. And so I don't have supervision. If you do quality control in a factory, the quality assurance department is not the people who produce the car. It's people who are afterwards. So the good principle of quality assurance is actually to have independence. So you normally would be guided towards a two-tier board. And I think there's a lot of arguments of one-tier boards, especially by the English and the British who have it, or, you know. But in fact, it's if you have a one-tier board, you have both executives and non-executives. And the difference between execution and supervision is not very, very clear. So I think in the end, what matters is not the legal form, though the legal form can influence the performance. It is the spirit, which is the board really responsible? And are they really willing to supervise execution? In the US, which has mixed boards, because it's imported from the United Kingdom, in the US, one is actually moving more towards two-tier boards, which is the number of executives who are on the board is actually decreasing. With some companies, only the chief executive officer. With other companies, the chief executive officer and the chief financial officer. But if you go to the UK, the chief commercial officer would also be on the board. And the difference is, if I'm the chief commercial officer, I have a functional responsibility for commerce, for marketing, etc., for sales. But if I join a board, I become responsible for everything, marketing, finance, together with my other directors. So I actually take on a different role, a different hat. I think this is a very important point that you mentioned, because there is no one standard. There are countries that have two-tier boards, and there are countries that have one-tier boards. I think Ukraine has actually followed the German model, which I think is good, because I don't like the system where the CEO is also the chairman or the president of the board, because then you have a confusion, you know, between my role as a chairman and the role of the CEO, and I become sort of too important. People are afraid to talk to me. I know everything, you know. And I think to have real governance, you need to have independent directors, people who are willing to look at things from the outside and are willing to say it the way it is. So I think I'm happy Ukraine chose the German model without necessarily having this labor representation, shareholder representation, because on the German boards, you do not have independent directors. You typically have shareholder representatives or you have labor representatives. In summary, I think Ukraine has actually taken the good part of the German model, which is supervision and execution. Let's distinguish that. And I think without taking the whole parts of the German model, because there are many discussions about the German model. Let me close my answer with the following. I think first you create a board, and then pretty soon you're going to run out of time. And the time issue is a real constraint, because directors, are not full-time. So it's a profession, but it's a part-time. So one of the questions you have to decide is, how many days do you expect from me? Normally people say, minimum 2 days a month, but some boards require maybe, 5 days a month, which is 50 days a year. I think typically today, it's typically corporations which are quite complex, which require more time. I think you can't discuss everything in detail at the board, because people will get bored, and it's very inefficient. So this is why boards create committees. It's to go more in depth in discussions with executives. By the way, one typical committee is the executive committee, which is the people who are really going to execute. This is the CEO, CFO, who's on the executive committee. So that's one committee. The second committee typically is the audit committee, which is, can we trust the financial statements? Because we need to sign the financial statements, and this means we have to actually go into detail. So that would be the second committee. I think the third committee would typically be talent, executive nominations, and also remuneration. So I think that would be a third committee, because these are confidential discussions. It takes time. So do we have the right talent? Do we pay them well? Do we review them? And then do we also terminate them? And do we give them feedback? So again, these are oversight committees. This is not instead of the human resource committee. But I think a key element of companies today is talent, is the people. And so you don't just want to spend a lot of time on the finance and not on the people. So I would say audit for finance, talent, nomination, review for the people. And this is, of course, not all of the people, but it's typically the CEO and maybe the C-suite or the top executive committee. So these are the three committees. A fourth committee might be nominations. Let's look at candidates, let's review CVs. I think that would be, and then I think I always recommend also have a governance committee, which is, so a committee that reflects and say, okay, we know what we do, should we improve? And I think having a governance and ethics committee, I think is a good idea as well. So these are some of the committees, but there is, in some legislations you must have an audit committee, and in others you don't. It depends on the size of the company and also on the complexity of the company. The independent director is becoming a profession. I think you want people on the board who have experience in business, but also experience in board work. So I think it's increasingly becoming a profession, the independent director. And I think it's becoming sort of the last leg of somebody's career, professional career. So you've been an accountant, you've worked for an accounting firm, and I think, you have to retire at the age of 55, and then you become an independent director, and you might be chairman of the audit committee because you've done audits all your life, so you're extremely experienced. So I think, yes, it's becoming a new career, and I think this will help business be cleaner, more performance, more sustainable. So I think governance is very related to independent directors. Now, in governance, there is rarely a black and white answer. You can be so-called an independent director, but you always listen to the owner. So legally you're independent, but in fact, mentally, you're actually quite dependent. So again, every time you come back to the answer, governance is more spirit over form. So I can be legally independent or called an independent director in the board, so I'm one of the independent directors, but in fact not be dependent. One way to be very dependent is if you're a director and you do it for the money, you do it for the fee, then you want to stay on the board, so then you're going to be very nice with the chairman. You're not going to say you're a bad chairman, because if you say you're a bad chairman, you might lose your seat. I think real independence is, I will say what I want to say, and if I don't agree, I will walk away. So that doesn't mean I'm going to threaten to walk away, because you cannot threaten to walk away too often. But ultimate independence is, I'm an independent person So I do not depend on this job. So if I really think that A, you're not listening to me, that I don't want to be responsible for what happens in this company, you should walk out. And I would say not enough independent directors have this capacity of walking out. Why? Because the fee is good, because it's a great board, because it gives you reputation, because you have cocktail parties, because you have in the news, etc. But independence is key. There is no such thing as best practice. There are different practices. So don't say we have to do it like the United Kingdom. We have to do it. Every country has particular habits, cultures of government, which come from the history, which come from particular problems. And I think there is no best practice. So that's always the advice I say. Be very careful if people say we have to do it like in the US. We have to do it like in Australia. We have to do it like in France. Actually, it's easier to point to bad governance countries than it is to point to good governance countries. But any student who's interested in governance, I would say Canada is increasingly regarded as one of the better countries. There is a coalition of people, independent. It's called the Canadian Coalition of Good Governance. I think that's a very good website, www.ccgg, and you will see simple documents describing documents. So that would be a next step where people might go. Of course, you have the Ukrainian Corporate Governance Academy, which is starting, but the coalition of the Canadian Coalition has been going on for a lot of time. Another good source for governance, also for international comparisons, are the accounting firms, PwC, Deloitte, KPMG, Ernst & Young, and Mazars, and they also have a lot of information. So I would say the second, I think go and inform yourself and don't be hostage to one view. So get informed from different view, and in the end, you have to establish the corporate governance that fits in your country. You can't deviate too much from the habits in the country because people will get very confused, and governments won't allow you. But I think you have to establish your own rules and your own habits and your own culture of governance, which is who contributes, what is the spirit, can we challenge each other, can we talk about difficult issues. And I think this is in a certain way less a question of country than a question of company and corporation. You need to have an organization which thinks about the state of corporate governance in Ukraine, the particular aspects of it, and of course to have a voice on governance. So the first role is be a voice, be a conscience, having a public statement, and now not be too involved in politics, but more in terms of standards, performance. It's defending corporate governance. I think that's one, which basically means occasionally saying this is not acceptable, but I think a good academy will not necessarily say that too often. The second role is, of course, as you mentioned, develop competences. And I think there is a transition to be made between being an executive and being a board member. And for this, a short program is actually very useful. It's to accompany the transition. So for example, if you're a soccer player, you normally go to coaching school. Now that's actually, it could be a year, 2-3 years. So now coaching, I would say, soccer coaching is much easier than, being on a board of Naftagaz or Exxon or, a big bank. And in business, we are amateurs. We say, okay, no, you don't need schooling, you can go there, etc. So I would say over time, the teaching and the development of competences will grow. Particularly that in governance, you can't make too many mistakes. So in management, you learn from the mistakes. This is always, we are learning organizations, we're very good because we make a lot of mistakes and we learn rapidly, and then we don't repeat the mistakes. In governance, you can't say that. You can't say, well, I'm acquiring a lot of companies, but I make a lot of mistakes because you're going to be bankrupt. So what is the alternative to learning by doing? It's learning by studying and learning by training. So education is typically a fast forward to not repeating other people's mistakes. And that's why very often the teaching is negative. We have negative examples because actually just already avoiding negative examples is actually a great learning. So I always say to students of any corporate governance academy, get on the board, get experience, and actually the small boards, the startup boards, the not-for-profit boards are some of the most difficult boards to be on. So get good experience early. There is no excuse to say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not on the board, You can always, join a board of a school, you can join a board of a hospital. And I think sort of get on the board early. And I think as an executive, it's another view, it's the outside-in view compared to the inside-out view when you're an executive. So it also makes you a better executive. So every executive should be on boards. It's please join the academy and join the ranks of students. I've now taught twice in the program. I think it's a great group of people, motivated people, young people as well, and not only young people, but also young people. In Western Europe, very often I have old people and then they don't go back to school. So here you have a young group. All of these people I think have good national patriotic values, which is they want to help Ukraine. So I find the spirit is very good, and it's a way of building the Ukrainian nation and the Ukrainian democracy. So from the corporate side. So I think I certainly have a view of, first, it's good for you because I want you to be a director. I don't want you to be a director without training, because the training helps you reflect, and you don't want to be alone. So you want to also have a group of people you can direct and network with. And I think the academy gives all three things. And so certainly I would highly encourage. Now it's very short. It's only 3 times 2 days. I would even say it could be longer. But it's better than a day and it's better than 2 days. So I also like the fact that it's in 3 modules. So it's a journey. And I think talk to the people who have done it, and I think they should be contagious, and they should encourage you to join.